Welcome to the One Drink Book Club. Tonight we're going to be discussing The Wager, a tale of shipwreck, mutiny, and murder by David Grann. The book tells the true story of a British naval ship that wrecks off the coast of Chile in the 1700s. It's a tale of death, destruction, betrayal, and survival. My guest tonight is my friend Dan Perry, who is an avid reader and collector of books, as you can see from his background if you're watching the video version of this, and is an author in his own right. Welcome, Dan.
Welcome. Thanks you very much, Jamie. This has been a trip.
It was a great book, and it was a suggestion that you made to me at the Super Bowl. We were watching the Super Bowl together, and you said, hey, if you were looking for a good book, I've got one for you. So I thought it was fantastic. And for those who haven't read the book, it's a true story, and it's really impeccably researched by the author. But Dan, why don't you give a little bit of an overview of what happens? I don't think we can do any spoilers because it already all happened. I think the real interesting part of this is how it all happens. It's the details that really are the fascinating part. So, but why don't you give the overview of what this was about?
I can do that, or we can start and talk about the drink.
Well, we can start. All right. Yes, I'd like to talk about the drink. What did you?
This is the One Drink Book Club, isn't it? I mean, why go dry?
Sure. What are we waiting for? Well, go ahead. What did you make tonight?
So what I have is the painkiller, which, given the ordeals that we will learn about in reading The Wager, they certainly could have used a painkiller. And a painkiller is actually a trademark name of this company, Hussar's
Rum. Hussar's
Royal British Navy Rum. Hussar's. We got to be careful with that pronunciation, but they bought the recipe from the British Navy in 1979. But the history of it is that going back to 1633, when the Brits invaded Jamaica and discovered that the locals were making rum, that they started allotting a half pint of rum a day to all midshipmen. And this was a great British tradition that lasted until the late 1970s, although they started watering it down because British rum was proofed at 110 proof.
Oof.
And they're handing out half pints a day. And, they were, with a lot of schnockered sailors. So over the decades, they started mixing it with water, lime juice, and sugar. So we've got the beginnings of margaritas and daiquiris and all kinds of things going on here. But the rum itself, I found this fascinating. It's the only alcohol that we consume that actually was a byproduct of industrial waste.
I did know that. I've read
that. You would know that, of course.
Well, no, but because of the molasses and from the sugarcane and the sugarcane production.
Exactly. And from that we get rum, and then we've got British Royal rum, and all of that leads to a painkiller, which is 2 ounces of rum, or a little more if your wrist kind of shakes a little bit, 4 ounces of pineapple, 1 of fresh squeezed orange juice, 1 of cream of coconut, shaken with ice, dusted with nutmeg, and they ask for it to be garnished with orange, but since we're going to be talking later about scurvy, I thought a lime made much more sense.
I think that's a perfect drink. We were in St. John over the holidays this year and had many a painkiller, and they are a delicious drink.
There you go. Good for you.
Very enjoyable. And so you went with something, I had a feeling you were going to go very British Navy on me with the drink. So I tried to go something a little bit different than that. And what I researched was cocktails popular in the Patagonia region
Oh,
and in South America. And
nice.
what I found was a drink called the Patagonian Cliffhanger, which I thought was a great name for
Oh,
this book because as you were reading it, you weren't quite sure what was going to happen. It had a lot of cliffhangers. And so the Patagonian Cliffhanger is
mm, nice.
made of 2 ounces of Tracal, which is an Argentinian liqueur that's made from Patagonian apples. So it's kind of an appley flavor. And then 1 ounce of Aperol, a half ounce of fresh lime juice, half ounce of agave nectar, and 2 dashes of orange bitters.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Jamey, you're a master at this, so I bow down.
Oh, well, it's tasty, but probably not as tasty as your painkiller because they hold a special place in my heart.
It's
Those
nice.
painkillers.
Anyway, so back to the story. Let me just the synopsis a little bit for your readers, so your
Yeah.
viewers. First of all, David Grann. Those of you who read, as I know you did, Jamey, Killers of the Flower Moon, we're back with that same author. He tells a story that who knew these things happened, and yet so it's fresh, new to us, the reader, and with the detail and the verisimilitude, if I can use that word, of the times, it comes to life. A fabulous read. Killers of the Flower Moon, obviously made into a movie with Martin Scorsese and Leonardo DiCaprio. Guess what? The Wager is now in production. Again, Scorsese and DiCaprio. So look for it in some several months or a year. But read the book first because as the old cliche is, the book is where the action is. And in this case, that goes double.
I would think so. There's so much great background and tidbits about the time, about the Navy,
Yeah.
about how all of this worked in the 1740s when this occurred, that I think you'll get snippets of it in a movie, but there's just not enough time
Yeah.
to
No, no.
follow all that. And so
Yeah.
definitely agree that you need to read the book first. And he does such a fantastic job of turning something that is a nonfiction historical relaying of the tale, but in a way that almost reads like a novel. And you really feel like you get to know the characters, the personalities, and it has kind of separate parts about how this all happened. There's the whole lead up to when the ships before the ships leave. There's the journey itself, the shipwreck, and then the ensuing situation on land and how they deal with that. All of that stuff just is gripping, and you feel like it is something that is written out of somebody's imagination, a great storyteller, and it's fascinating to find out that it's true.
Yes. Yes. And it does. There is a suspense to it, even as these are things that happened 300 years ago. You're literally hanging on to find out what's going to happen next because there are switchbacks, there are things that go back and forth that you can't imagine. Anyway, so back to the synopsis. Graham opens the book with its 1740s southeast coast of Brazil. People see this thing out on the horizon. It's floating toward the coast. As it gets closer, they see it's some kind of a boat, but the masts have been broken. The sails are shredded. It's leaking. It's kind of part raft and part boat. And when it gets to land, out pours 30 men, shrunken to the bones, bug-eyed, hair matted. These are men that have gone through some kind of hell, and they relate that they are the last survivors of a British man of war that sailed from Portsmouth, England, a year and a half earlier had thought to have been lost going around the Cape Horn, and now here they, come in on this raft, and people are amazed that they could still be alive. 50 of them had died on the way just getting in on this raft, and they're hailed as heroes. They are the survivors of a terrible tragedy that's happened to the British Navy. Well, that right there would have made a pretty gripping nautical story, right up there with
Sure.
Patrick O'Brien and all of the rest. But that's just half of it, because 6 months after this leaky raft pulls ashore on the southeast shore of Brazil, another boat, basically a dugout with 3 Englishmen aboard, appears in Peru on the other side of the continent. And it's the captain of the ship and a couple of the men that are loyal to him. And they say that the first guys are not heroes, they're scoundrels. They're mutineers. They have violated the most basic laws of England and of the Navy. Well, in time, both stories end up back in London, and now they're pitted against one another in front of a very formal court martial of the British Admiralty. Which ones? The charges are mutiny, murder, cannibalism. The whole thing spills out. And for the people of the day, this is a true crime of the 18th century story that, it really kind of got lost in the mists of history ever since. And now Graham has put it into this novel.
Well, and we're lucky that it did go to a court martial, because one of the things that a court situation like this provides is the legal records of it. And so the depositions and the witnesses, and several of the people who survived this wrote down their tales. Some of them actually had log books that they kept throughout the entire journey, throughout the shipwreck time. And I cannot believe that these things survived, and that Grann was able to get those and, comb through them and ferret out the story. I can't imagine the kind of analysis you'd have to do, not only to read the script, because this was all handwritten, but then to also interpret the, terms of the day and the way that the writing style was and everything else. Really interesting.
Well, not only were there logbooks and evidence that was put into before the court martial, but books were written about this, including by some of the survivors. One of them, the first one to get back to England, John Bulkeley, who was the gunner and therefore had access to the stores of all the armament on the original ship. He's the one that landed his men in Brazil, and he wrote a scandalous book about his daring do in going back and forth through the Straits of Magellan, where the Pacific and the Atlantic meet, and it's like a funnel and the fastest and longest current in the world, and how they navigated all of this. And Bulkeley wrote this book, claiming, of course, to be a hero and his men to be heroes. And that had been in circulation in England for years before the captain got there to tell his side of the story. The interesting thing is that, and I won't give away the twist at the very end about how the ruling finally came down between the dueling narratives here. But it's almost beside the point. The essence was the ordeal that they all went through when they were shipwrecked on Wager Island, as they called it. And by the way, that's the name of the original British man of war, a class 6 square-masted man of war. named HMS His Majesty's Ship Wager. Uh, they ended up on this island, and then almost immediately divided into camps. There was those that accused the captain of having screwed things up so badly that left them there. There was the other side that said that there was a mutiny going on, and then they just went to war back and forth, and some tried to get out one way, and the others tried to get out another way. Uh, but it's the ordeals that David Grann, the author, details so much: the starvation, the winds, the colds, the currents, the treacherous conditions there at Tierra del Fuego, at the very tip of South America. That's what the reader will not soon forget.
Yeah, it was, it really turned into kind of a Lord of the Flies situation. And where you had a bunch of desperate men who were, unbelievably hungry, first of all, but then were lacking everything. They lacked shelter. They lacked
Yes.
any of the creature comforts, even as minuscule as they were on a British man of war. They were really stuck out there with nothing. But that is before they even get to the shipwreck situation. The voyage from Britain to where they ended up in South America, that was pretty horrible. We referenced scurvy, and the boat got that. It got some sort of viral disease, and at the time, the ship had a surgeon, so a doctor, but pretty much he was only good for amputating things. I mean, they had no knowledge of how to fix any of this, and I really didn't realize what scurvy did. So scurvy, without enough vitamin C, the collagen in your body ceases to be made, and so collagen kind of binds all your joints. It kind of lubricates all your joints, and so you get this painful. It's like painful arthritis, but then like your teeth start falling out. Like collagen makes a big deal, and it starts to affect your brain and how you're thinking. And so people really just kind of waste away. And it was amazing to me. I did a little research, and there was a naval surgeon that basically figured out that vitamin C, lemons, and limes really was a great way to combat scurvy. In like 1753, he discovered that, but it wasn't implemented as a policy of the British Navy until 1795. I mean, 40 years later almost, before they actually made sure there were lemons and limes on the ships to keep people healthy.
One of the things that I love about any book, but especially in historical fiction, is when I'm learning things. And I, like you, I'd heard about scurvy and seamen and the high seas and how limes eventually saved it, and that's why the Brits are called limeys as a slur. But I didn't know what scurvy was. I thought it was like a skin disease.
Yeah.
No, you're right. It was horrific. He said that bones that had been mended in these men started dissolving and breaking away again, and all of their connective tissue is deteriorating. And yeah, the teeth falling out, their skin turns blue, and they died from respiratory distress because their lungs no longer could function. Wow. So that's scurvy. That was just one of the things that I learned about it. I also learned much more vividly about press gangs. Even
Yes.
before they sail, the practice of ships' captains needing crew and, not finding a lot of always men, who had any kind of experience. So they got groups of armed men that prowl the waterfront bars and the alleyways and along the roads, and anybody wearing a certain kind of checkered shirt or pants with wide knees. Ah, this
Or had
guy's been a
stained
snaker.
hands. You know, their hands were stained with tar because
Yeah, if
they
they
used
had
tar
tar on
on
their
the ship.
fingers,
Yep.
because then the seamen were called tars because they were always patching things with tar because it was waterproof. Uh, and even ships that were coming back from long voyages, and here was the crew, you know, here's their wives and families on shore. Welcome home. No, no, the press crews went out and grabbed them, put on another ship, and off they went.
Yeah, it was unbelievable, and it was a
Like the
legal
18th
practice.
century.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
I don't know why anybody would ever hang out in one of those port cities if there was a shot that they're going to get kidnapped and put on a ship, and the the fatality rates on these ships were astronomical. In this case, the Wager, that boat was one of 7 boats that left the harbor as part of this trip, and only one made it back, essentially, and they left with 2,000 sailors when they started, and ended up with like somewhere between 200 and 250 at the very end. I mean, it's
Yeah,
unbelievable.
yeah.
Um, and so even the Wager, before they got shipwrecked, they had lost about half their crew to scurvy and other illnesses. It was crazy.
You mentioned Lord of the Flies. Uh, William Golding brought that out in 1954, in which a group of English school children are marooned on an island because there's been a plane crash or a shipwreck or something, and very quickly they resort, and these are, English school children, and they resort to his Hobbesian world of, an eye for an eye, struggle of the survival of the fittest, and then horrible things happen as they start to prey on one another until the very last scene. And I don't know if you remember this from reading Lord of the Flies. Who rescues them? A British naval officer comes ashore in his dress whites. And of course, he's been out scouting for Russians. This is the Cold War.
Right.
And so they're just playing it out on a larger scale. And he comes in and finds these boys, and they're all going to be rescued. But that is essentially the plot of The Wager, where you have this very fast deterioration of all of the norms of civilization. And I'll mention 2 things. One was an experiment that was done in 1946, the Minnesota starvation experiment, in which a group of volunteers, all men, volunteered to experience slow deprivation and then complete, starvation style intakes. And the volunteers at the end of it were astounded at how quickly they kind of turned against one another, and all of their, you know, religious and ethical training just kind of fell by the wayside. And there's a quote by Eric Sevareid, who is a famous CBS reporter and commentator, about the time of the Hurricane Katrina. Sevareid was quoting as saying, uh, all civilization is only 7 meals away from complete chaos.
I
And
think there is something to be
what we
said.
see in this book, but you see it over and over and over again.
Well, I remember the part where he talks about that study, and first of all, I thought to myself, anybody who knows me would know that I would never volunteer study. I mean, who in their right mind? I mean, everybody who volunteered for that was kind of demented anyway. Um, but but you're absolutely right. It's all you can think about when you are hungry, and all of your effort goes to try to, you know, satiate yourself in some form or fashion. And it was interesting at one point as these guys are trying to survive on Wager Island, and they have very little. There's very few animals on the island. It's not like you could go hunting. They had some birds, there were some shellfish. And at one point, some locals, some indigenous people showed up, and they were actually super helpful to them because they showed them, how they fished and some other skills. But it was amazing how tough the environment was, and that the indigenous people had figured out how to live there. But they eventually they do learn that there's some seaweed they can eat. They're able to go back to the ship and bring some of the supplies that were on the ship, even though it was wrecked. They were able to salvage some. But they really, that was a main cause of concern, is that, and the other part was they did collect all this food, and then people would steal from it.
Yeah,
People would sneak into the tent
that's
and
the
take
Lord of the
more than their
Flies.
share. Yeah,
So,
totally.
yeah. Slow cakes. Do you remember that? That was this stringy seaweed that they found that if they boiled it for 2 hours and mixed it with some flour and fried it in the melted tallow from candles, they could make this little crispy cake. And that was a great delicacy. But it was the indigenous people that ultimately led the captain and his few remaining loyal men all the way up the coast, the Pacific coast of South America, and ultimately to Valparaiso, what is today Valparaiso, Chile, where they were immediately, of course, thrown into a prison. And
Because the Spanish, they're still at war with with Spain,
you know,
and
they were out there hunting the Spanish galleons, hoping to relieve them of all of their silver from the New World mines. And so they were imprisoned, and then they were released, and there were years went by before they could, almost 5 years, I think, before they all could get them all back to London and stand trial. What
yeah,
a what an epic!
it really was. And it was an interesting battle between, there was a debate on the island once the ship was gone. And part of the debate was, well, is the captain still the captain? Because apparently British law says that once a ship is wrecked, the sailors no longer get pay for their time. So if they're not getting paid as being part of the Navy, are they bound by the naval laws and the naval hierarchy and the rules? And so clearly some said, well, no, we're not. We don't have to listen to the captain. We can do our own thing. And as you mentioned, Bulkley, the gunner, was a real natural leader. He was not part of he was kind of a blue collar guy. He was a very experienced seaman, knew his stuff, but he was not part of the officer corps, so to speak. I mean, he led people on the gun deck, and had his responsibilities, but he was not part of kind of the officers. But the men did listen to him because they knew he was competent, and he just was kind of this naturally charismatic uh, person that people wanted to follow. Whereas David Cheap,
Cheap.
the captain, kind of was this vain, kind of pompous guy. He had just gotten his captainship on this trip. Another one of the captains had died, and so he kind of got promoted, and he really saw it as his chance to be kind of king of the world, and was not really rising to the occasion. And so that really created a lot of the tension on the island, was that people felt like, well, we should follow the captain, but this other guy has much better ideas.
Well, we're talking about British society in the 18th century and beyond, class based, hierarchical based. What your accent is determines where you fall in the pecking order. So that was all very much so. And then we had this one fascinating character, John Byron,
Yes.
who was a young gentleman, an aristocrat, and who had ambitions to climb the ladder, and he kind of was going back and forth between the captain and Bulky and the blue collar, the men, and he would go back and forth, and he was writing it all down. He was quite a writer, and we find out only at the end that he's the grandfather of Lord Byron.
Yeah,
Kind of a little twist there.
totally.
So
Well,
there's so many, there's so much of it resonated down through the centuries. It touched Melville all the way to Patrick O'Brien and his Aubrey Maturin series that have the same ships at the same time, and to Lord of the Flies, surprisingly, which it really does parallel. And even the philosophers of the day, Montesquieu and Rousseau and Voltaire, they all commented about all of this because it really did raise the question, how human are we? Especially in a class-based society and in an imperial power, England, that, I mean, without giving too much away, this whole thing ultimately got swept under the historical rug because here was Britain claiming to be the more civilized society, and that gave them the right to go around colonizing and pretty badly mistreating and oppressing others who were not civilized because they were of a higher quality. And here was the evidence in that court martial. Just under the surface, all men are brutes, including Englishmen.
well, yeah, you know, as you said, you strip away all of these things. You strip away the rules that you're no longer in the Navy
Yeah.
because you're shipwrecked. You don't have any food. You don't have any shelter. Everything kind of goes out the window, and it really is uh, a free for all. And as you say, you know, murder was part of it. I'm not going to give away who was murdered and who wasn't, but um, my question was, if you were there, did you? I don't know if you pictured yourself in this situation. Would you align yourself with the captain, David Cheap, or would you um, kind of side with the gunner?
Well, a little bit like you, Jamie, saying you would never volunteer for that starvation experiment. I think I would have stayed the hell away from ships and port cities and would have stayed out of that whole scene because
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to be in that situation because neither of them were, you know, having a vacation.
Well,
There
that's
was
true.
a lot of pain, and they needed a lot of painkillers on both sides.
Well, it does tell you something about the rest of society at the time because it must have been pretty rough on land too, that people did. I mean, half the crew did volunteer to be out there.
Yeah.
So if that was the case, man, the rest of the world that they existed in must have been pretty bad as well.
Well, and it wasn't just England. I mean, Spain really ruled the seas at that time. They had struck it rich in the New World, and they had access to gold and silver and slaves. And England had a growing merchant marine element. They wanted to trade. They weren't able to really trade in the Spanish cities and in the Spanish waters, but through some legislative shenanigans, Britain allowed some British ships to go into Spanish ports if they were trading slaves. And while they were there, they were bringing sugar and wool and things. And then the Spanish started, you know, harassing the British ships, and the British ships started harassing the Spanish ships. And the next thing you knew, you had a worldwide maritime war between these two great powers. All of that is the background to this one man of war that was out trying to find a nice fat galleon to board and to sack, and here's what happened to them. So it's quite a background. And again, David Grann puts all of this in a way that just pulls you along page by page by page.
I read a number of reviews, kind of preparing for tonight, and I can't tell you how many of them said, I read this in a day, or I read it in 2 days, kind of really cruise through it, which was my experience as well. I think I read it basically in 2 days. It was a plane flight to Vegas and a plane flight back, and that was my entertainment. I did not watch any of the movies, but it was great, and it was really entertaining. So I really appreciate your recommendation. So before we close here, what are you reading right now? What's on the desk right now?
I just finished reading The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by
Good.
James McBride, which is just a wonderful read. It's set in the 1930s in a kind of a nowhere town in Pennsylvania where Jewish members of town had all lived on this hill, and as they got more prosperous, they moved downtown, and blacks moved in, and there were some Jews that were left behind, and ultimately they became kind of partners. And it's a nice story, but there's some blackguards afoot as well, and bad things happen to good people, and it's a terrific read. This is the same author that wrote blanking out on it, but oh, that's too bad.
That's all right. But it
But
sounds like an excellent book. I'll have to try. I'll put it on the list.
The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store. It's a terrific read.
Excellent.
And
Well,
I'm also reading picking up after many, many years, a kind of a cop and robber book called The Friends of Eddie Coyle.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever heard of it. The author is George Higgins, who was actually a assistant district attorney in Boston at the time. And it's kind of a mob book, people trying to move guns in Boston. And Norman Mailer wrote a terrific blurb on the back of the book saying, this is one of the best police books, or just one of the best books. The dialogue in this book is one of the best I ever read. And wouldn't you know, it was written by the Fuzz. And it is good. It's terrific. How about you? What are you reading?
Well, I just finished a book that I enjoyed. It was called West with Giraffes. Have you heard of this?
No.
So it's a really interesting read. It's based on a true story that in the 1930s, the San Diego Zoo ordered 2 giraffes from Africa. They came across the Atlantic in a ship. The ship hit a hurricane, and then the giraffes, which were on the deck in their crates, survived the hurricane. The ship limps into a port in New York City, and the zoo had sent one of their zookeepers with a specially made truck that could house the giraffes. So one of the giraffes had a broken leg, but he had to drive these giraffes all the way across country. And so that's the true story, but the characters and the stories of the characters are all made up by the author. And it's a neat story that there's a young guy who's an Okie who had left during the Dust Bowl to go live with his cousin. His whole family had died. He moved to New York to be with his only living relative. His only living relative died in that hurricane that hit the boat and hit New York. And so he starts following the giraffe truck because he's really enthralled with these giraffes. And it's the best way he knows to get to California. They didn't have interstates at the time. So it was not an easy thing to navigate your way all the way to California from New York, because you either took the Lincoln Highway or the Lee Highway. And so his idea was he stole a motorcycle and kind of trails behind the truck. And lo and behold, the driver ends up having a meltdown and abandoning the zookeeper. So this young guy fills in, and he gets to know the zookeeper, and there's another woman who's a reporter that's kind of following them. So it's a whole story of this threesome kind of going across country with these giraffes. And it's, they have all these challenges because any overpass that's over 12 feet, they can't go under, and, all these things. So, and then every time they make it to a town, it's like they're the circus because everybody's thinking, oh my gosh, what was that? They've never seen giraffes. So it was a cute story, but it was also heartwarming, and the characters were really good too.
Title again?
Title is West with Giraffes.
Just that one phrase that you uttered, he following the giraffe truck to California. That's pretty classic. By the way, the James McBride book that some may have read is called Deacon King Kong.
Oh, I loved that book.
All right.
Really enjoyed it.
Same author as the Heaven and Earth grocery store.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for taking the time. This was fun. And like I said, I appreciate the recommendation. A great book.
It was enormously fun, and I salute you and all of the listeners in the One Drink Book Club. Salute.
All right.
What a great idea. I love it. Love it.